jawbone surfaces in a cave system beneath the Jordan Rift Valley. The carbon dating comes back wrong. Not wrong by a little, wrong by centuries, placed in a stratum that, according to the conventional flood chronology, should contain no human remains at all. The bone sits in a drawer in a regional museum, unpublished, because publishing it would require explaining something the official record cannot explain. A human lineage that should have ended did not end. Cain was marked, exiled, and according to most readings of Genesis, his line should vanish beneath the floodwaters along with everyone else outside the ark. But a careful reading of the genealogies, cross-referenced against extra-biblical sources, preserved by two unconnected ancient communities, suggests something else. It suggests that Cain's bloodline did not simply disappear. It suggests that it was still walking the earth in the final years before the flood, and that this fact was deliberately smoothed over by the very texts meant to record it. Why would anyone bury that detail, and what does it mean that they did? The cold air smells of wet stone and animal fat burning low. The sky over the eastern hills is the color of a bruise, heavy with cloud that never quite breaks. Children huddle near a fire pit, watching shapes move at the tree line. Tall shapes, too tall. Their shoulders fill the gaps between the trees, like the trees themselves had grown arms. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a sound rolls down the valley that is not thunder and not an animal. The people in this camp do not know the word Nephilim yet. They do not need to. They know enough to keep the fire burning all night and to never let the smallest children wander toward the sound. What follows is an account of who these shapes were, where they came from, and how one man's exile 7 generations earlier set the conditions for their arrival. Scripture says, Cain was driven out after the murder of Abel, marked and sent to the land of Nod, east of Eden. Genesis 4 then gives a genealogy. Cain fathered Enoch, Enoch fathered Irad, and the line continues through Mehujael, Methushael, and finally Lamech, the 7th generation, from Adam through Cain. Lamech is recorded as a man of violence, boasting of killing a man, and declaring that vengeance for him would be 77-fold. After Lamech's children are named, Genesis 4 simply stops. The text moves to a fresh genealogy through Seth in chapter 5, and Cain's line is never mentioned again. No death notice, no destruction narrative specific to this branch. It simply ends on the page, mid-sentence, as though the scroll were cut. This is the gap. Genesis 5 then carries the Sethite line forward in careful detail, recording exact ages, exact lifespans, building toward Noah. The implication most readers absorb is that Cain's line was simply absorbed into the general wickedness later, destroyed by the flood, indistinguishable from everyone else. But the genealogical math does not actually require that. The 7 generations of Cain's line, if their lifespans followed anything resembling the pattern recorded for the Sethite line in the same chapters, would place the final generations of Cain's descendants alive and active during the same centuries as Noah's grandfather and great-grandfather. The official account leaves this question completely unaddressed. What happened to these people? Where did they go? And were they still present when the floodwaters came? The Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees both preserve independently by communities with no contact with one another. For over 1,000 years, the Qumran community near the Dead Sea and the Ethiopian Orthodox Church in the highlands of Aksum fill exactly this silence. Neither text treats Cain's line as having quietly disappeared. Both treat the pre-flood world as a single interconnected population in which the descendants of Cain were not separate from the events involving the Watchers and the Nephilim, but were already present, already established, and already part of the social fabric the Watchers descended into. Jubilees in particular places the genealogical weight on intermarriage. It describes the sons of God, understood by the Ethiopian tradition as the Watchers, taking wives from the daughters of men, a phrase that in the Jubilees framing specifically includes the daughters of Cain's line, not merely Seth's. This single detail rewrites the entire picture. If Cain's descendants were among those whose daughters intermarried with the Watchers, then Cain's bloodline did not vanish. It was absorbed directly into the genetic catastrophe Genesis 6 describes, and it was present in some form until the very last days before the flood. Here is where the Hebrew matters. Genesis 4:17 uses the verb yada, to know, when describing Cain's union with his wife, the standard term for marital relations throughout the Torah. But by the time Jubilees describes the unions between the Watchers and the daughters of men in the generations leading to the flood, the language shifts. The text uses a phrase that, in the underlying Ge'ez, the language of the Ethiopian manuscripts, carries the sense of taking or seizing rather than ordinary marriage, a term closer to forceful acquisition than courtship. What is lost when this is simply translated as married is the asymmetry. The Watchers were not entering ordinary unions with willing partners under normal social custom. They were taking, and the population from which they were taking included, by the Jubilees framing, the granddaughters and great-granddaughters of Cain. Three independent ancient traditions describe a pre-flood population in which a marked or cursed founding lineage persists alongside a righteous lineage until the final catastrophe, and in each case this persisting lineage becomes entangled with a supernatural corrupting force just before the world ends. The Hebrew tradition, through Genesis and its Cain genealogy, followed immediately by the Watcher narrative of chapter 6, places the cursed line of Cain in direct chronological adjacency to the descent of the Watchers, with no narrative gap between them. The Mesopotamian tradition, recorded in the Sumerian king list and related texts, describes the antediluvian kings as a line distinct from ordinary humanity, ruling enormous lifespans, whose final generations are entangled with the Anunnaki, divine beings, who descend and intermix with the ruling population immediately before deluge tablets describe. The Mandaean tradition, preserved by a community in the marshes of southern Iraq with roots reaching back to antiquity, retains its own account of a cursed primordial fratricide, whose descendants persist as a corrupting presence in the world, right up until a great flood purges the earth, a structure startlingly close to the Genesis sequence, despite no contact between these communities and the Hebrew scribal tradition during their formative centuries. Three traditions, three cursed founding lines, three identical placements of that line in the final generation before a flood. The statistical probability that three unconnected cultures independently invented the same structural detail, a marked lineage surviving in parallel until the eve of a deluge, is effectively zero. Genesis 6:12 describes the result in language that is easy to read past. All flesh had corrupted its way upon the earth. The Hebrew is kol basar, literally all flesh, a phrase used elsewhere in Genesis to denote every living biological category without exception. Not all people, all flesh. The corruption described is not described as moral only. It is described as a corruption of baser itself, of biological matter, of the category of flesh as a whole. If Cain's line had, by this point, been absorbed into the general population through generations of intermarriage, and that population was now also intermarried with the Watchers and their offspring, then Kol Basar describes precisely what the genealogical gap in Genesis 4 leaves unexplained. Not a separate doomed lineage off in its own corner of the world, but a single, interbred, corrupted population, encompassing every line, Cainite and otherwise, by the time Noah's generation arrives. What removed this connection from the common reading was not a single decree, but a long editorial habit. The genealogical table in Genesis 4 was preserved in its terse form by scribal tradition, because genealogies of this kind functioned as legal and lineage records, not narrative ones. Their abrupt endings were normal for the genre and were not flagged as requiring explanation, not because the connection to the Watcher narrative was considered false, not because later editors actively suppressed a known doctrine, but because the terse genealogical form, copied faithfully for centuries, simply did not carry forward the narrative bridge that Jubilees and Enoch, composed later and in a different genre, felt free to supply. The result was the same regardless of intent. A reader of Genesis alone sees two unrelated genealogies and a separate, unexplained Watcher episode. A reader with access to Jubilees sees one continuous population history. The councils that later determined which texts entered the canon, working in the centuries around Nicaea and after, inherited this already divided picture and ratified it, excluding Enoch and Jubilees from most canons, not primarily because their content about Cain's line was considered dangerous on its own, but because by that point these texts were associated with a broader body of angelology and Watcher tradition that ecclesiastical authorities of the 4th and 5th centuries viewed as theologically destabilizing, opening doors to speculation about angelic hierarchies, fallen powers, and hybrid beings that the developing Orthodox frameworks preferred to close. The genealogical bridge connecting Cain to the flood generation was not the target. It was collateral. It went down with the rest of the Enochic material, and the silence in Genesis 4 was left standing, unremarked, for 2,000 years. Read together, the picture resolves. Cain was exiled but not erased. His line continued for generations, its lifespans likely comparable to the Sethite line recorded alongside it, placing his final descendants alive during the same centuries as Noah's father and grandfather. Jubilees and Enoch, preserved independently in Qumran and Ethiopia, describe a pre-flood population in which the daughters of men who intermarried with the Watchers were not a separate group from Cain's descendants, but included them. The Ge'ez language of unions describes a seizing rather than a courtship, an asymmetry lost in the word married. Genesis 6:12's kol basar, all flesh, describes the resulting corruption as total, not partial, a single interbred population rather than isolate bad actors. And 3, independent ancient traditions, Hebrew, Mesopotamian, and Mandaean, each preserve the same structural memory, a marked founding lineage, persisting until the very edge of a world-ending flood. Cain's bloodline was not a closed chapter by the time of Noah. It was an open thread, woven into the fabric of the very corruption the flood was sent to end. Jesus, in Matthew 24, describes the days before his return as being like the days of Noah, a comparison most readers take as a general statement about moral decline. But read against this reconstructed history, the comparison carries a more specific weight. The days of Noah were not simply wicked in a generic sense. They were days in which marked, corrupted lineages, lines that should have remained separate, had become entangled with forces beyond ordinary humanity, producing a population so thoroughly compromised that only a narrow remnant could be preserved. If that is the pattern Jesus is invoking, then, like the days of Noah, is not a statement about bad behavior in general. It is a statement about entanglement, about boundaries that were supposed to hold and did not. The genealogical silence in Genesis 4 was never a dead end. It was a doorway left open, and on the other side of it stood the population the flood was sent to end. Cain's bloodline did not disappear into the wilderness east of Eden. It walked forward into history until the water finally caught up with it